Hello everyone, my name is Kailin Liu. I'm a Chinese background teacher teaching EAL English as an additional language at a public secondary school in Melbourne, Australia. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land on which we're gathered here and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and future. My presentation today is about knowledge building through collaborative translation and translanguaging practices, a study based on a text messaging moment that happened between Dr. Julie Choi and me one evening in 2020, where we try to solve a linguistic problem together. We are at once the researchers and the participants of our own study, and in this presentation, I'll also include what this experience means for me in terms of teaching EAL. So I'll start my presentation by introducing a teaching problem that I face in relation to this idea called translanguaging. Then I'll discuss the relationship between translanguaging and translation before showing you an example taken from that text messaging experience to help us think through this problem. I'll finally conclude by sharing what we could learn from this experience. So I've always been wanting to enact this idea called translanguaging in my EAL class. Translanguaging is a different way of seeing languages, not as separate systems such as English and Chinese that sit within multilinguals' head, but instead as a fluid social practice where multilinguals draw on diverse linguistic and other resources from their one unitary repertoire to create meaning. From this translanguaging lens, EAL students are not deficient English speakers, but rather resourceful multilinguals because their home languages are no longer irrelevant or detrimental to their English learning, but always a part of their meaning-making repertoire and can help them expand their repertoires in English. So to promote translanguaging in my EAL class, like many teachers, I welcome students' use of home languages or dictionaries for translation if needed. However, I find these practices often become a simple multilingual signage and do not fully break the deficit and separatist mentality that translanguaging aims to break. For example, I may hear different languages in class but don't know how exactly they help stretch students' meaning-making repertoire. And even if many students are using translation to learn English, many still see it as an indicator of their incompetence in English and simply as a stepping stone that they should quickly learn to drop. I think all these suggest that there is definitely more we should do apart from just allowing translation and home languages in EAL classrooms. But what should we do more? And how can translation, this very common practice among multilinguals, work together with translanguaging to help students build knowledge about English? Next, I'll show you one example that precisely illustrates this process. But before I do that, I'll briefly explain the relationship between translation and translanguaging. Translanguaging, as I mentioned earlier, is a fluid social practice where multilinguals lift diverse resources to create meaning. Translation, therefore, can be seen as one of these practices. It is usually understood as a practice where one transmits ideas from language code A to B unidirectionally. However, translanguaging disrupts this unidirectionality. By seeing languages not as separate systems, translanguaging operates within the borderlands of code A and B, as seen embedded in the numerous dots here. It focuses more on what happens in these borderlands. How do multilinguals draw on diverse linguistic, cultural, and other resources to interpret and create meaning in their moments of translation? And by focusing on these moments, translanguaging also highlights that translation is not about reproducing the same meaning from code A to code B. Instead, by bringing together all these diverse linguistic, cultural, and other resources to negotiate meaning in the process, these translanguaging moments or translation actually reviews and produces subtle differences of meaning that are threaded throughout the entire social fabric. In other words, these translanguaging moments helps to diversify meanings in the process. Now, drawing on these understandings, I'll show you one example how I use translation and translanguaging practices to solve a linguistic problem and build knowledge of English. The linguistic problem revolves around this connective called besides with a comma straight after. In one evening in 2020, Julie texted me to seek my understanding of this connective since she found many Chinese students often misuse it. Yet, I was also not sure. I learned that besides means in addition or 另外 in Chinese, and it's used when we want to add an additional point. However, I didn't know why besides sounds weird in sentences such as Julie's presentation is accessible, besides it's rich in meaning. From my understanding, this was perfectly fine. So to solve this problem, Julie and I started to explore the meaning of besides. At one point, she texted me this sample sentence, in which the meaning of besides confused me. Here, the last part, meaning that we love money, contrasts with the sentence earlier we're not obsessed with money in meaning, so it can't be an additional point adding to the earlier sentence to support the first one. So to find out the meaning of besides here, I first translated these sentences into Chinese closely to understand their entire meaning. I didn't translate the word obsessed as it has different social connotations in Chinese based on its context of use, and I just would like to capture its original meaning as much as possible. However, using such Chinese translation, I still couldn't understand the connection between these sentences. So in step 2, I drew on my memory of witnessing my parents fighting over money to create a social context and ordered my Chinese translation into a new Chinese expression that captures its main idea but fits within this context. I then rehearsed this shorter expression with more emotions again and again, and finally the Chinese word 再说 emerged in between. I discovered that besides could mean 再说, and drawing on this context, I realized that besides is more than adding an additional point. It involves a stronger emotion where a person needs to add reasons to really justify something or to persuade someone. Reflecting back, this whole process of me discovering 再说 and more meanings for besides is way more than a unidirectional translation, but a translanguaging practice. It shows that code-for-code translation is closely intertwined with translanguaging moments, such as me using social linguistic knowledge of the word obsessed in Chinese to notice its varied social connotations, or me enacting register resources in Chinese, social experiences, and emotions in step 2 to create meaning in a richer and more familiar social context for this new meaning of besides to emerge. By zooming into all these processes of translation, it can be seen that they reveal not only my diverse fronts of knowledge, but ways in which these knowledges are mobilized to give rise to a different meaning of besides. And that's how my meaning-making repertoire in English expands through translation and translanguaging practices. So, what can we learn from this experience? I think the first thing is that if we want to truly enact translanguaging in EL class, we need to move beyond the product of translation or the visibility or audibility of different languages, but focusing on learners' meaning-making process during translation. Such focus can not only help teachers and learners see their diverse funds of knowledge as a way of resisting the deficit mentality, but also engage learners in the process of differentiating and diversifying meanings, which can help afford their expansion of meaning-making repertoire in English. In other words, translanguaging is not about diversifying languages, but diversifying meanings, and teachers should focus on this traffic of meaning rather than on fixed or decontextualized forms. Also, in order to do such translanguaging work, we need to shift the existing asymmetrical teacher-learner power relations and create spaces for collaborative knowledge building. While I don't have enough time to show you all the details, as seen in these text messages, it is important to note that behind that problem-solving moment is my collaborative dialogue with Julie, where Julie does not hold up her authority as a native speaker on this linguistic issue, but shifts between the roles of expert, biological partner, and learner to open up spaces for me to enact all my resources for language learning. Finally, I'd like to conclude my presentation with this quote from Alistair Pennycook, that if we wish to take global diversity seriously, we would do well to focus on semiodiversity, the diversity of meanings, as much as glossal diversity, the diversity of languages. And this is exactly where the emphasis on translation and translanguaging becomes crucial. Thank you very much for watching this presentation. The whole paper of this study on knowledge building through collaborative translation and translanguaging practices has been recently published in the Journal of Language, Identity and Education.